Good morning. My name is Matthew Tyler. I'm from Blackfoot. I'm here to rerun the breakout session we gave at PCI London in January entitled Risk and Reward. So we're going to look at what is risk. We're going to look at some real world examples. We're going to look at ALOP. We're going to look at cost benefit analysis. We're going to look at risk and PCI, the odd couple. How does a standard, which is binary, yes, no, address risk, which is sliders? We're going to look at the risk-based approach, or the PAT. We're going to look at what is a risk assessment. And more importantly, we're going to look at what is not a risk assessment. So what is a risk? A risk is the likelihood of an impact of an event happening, usually a bad event. How do other industries deal with risk? So when we're dealing, if we take ourselves out of the bubble of PCI and cards and look at real world risk where actual fatalities can happen, how do other industries deal with it? So likelihood, a micromort is a measure of riskiness of day-to-day activities. It's a 1 in a million probability of sudden death. So here's an interesting thing we can all do. Here's some different types of activities we can undertake. And where do we think these guys fit on a 1 in a million chance of death? Well, rather than you telling me, here we go. So obviously a base jump is more risky than a skydive. The main reason for that is that a skydive you only have a problem at the end, whereas a base jump you can potentially have a problem all the way down. So health and safety executive, as low as reasonably practical, or ALOP. Risk is grey. So what is reasonable spend to reduce a risk? So if I'm in the real world, how do I as a business ensure that I'm spending the right amount of money? And more importantly, how do I prove that spending a certain amount of money is grossly disproportionate to the risk? So if we take a UK health and safety example, the formula they use is the costs incurred in the risk happening, the benefit over the benefits of doing it, equals 1 times the DF. And DF is a disproportion factor, and it's based on the severity of the risk you're facing. So let's take the example of a chemical plant. So we're setting up a chemical plant. It's going to have a 25-year lifespan, and one of the processes, if it goes wrong, the impact's fairly high. It's going to end in 20 deaths, 40 permanent injuries, and several hundred either seriously or slightly injured people. They've already worked out that the likelihood of this event happening, the explosion happening, is 1 times 10 to the 5, or it's a 1 in every 100,000 year risk. And we've attached a disproportionate ratio to it of 10 due to the severity of the risk and the amount of permanent injuries and deaths. So how much is a life worth? Well, according to 2003 UK Health and Safety, a fatality is worth £1.336 million. In 2013, that's been rebalanced to 1.7. So the good news is, in the last 10 years, we're all worth 400,000 more. And here's the figures for permanent injury, serious injury, and slight injury. So if we were looking at the example we gave of the chemical factory, we have 20 fatalities. We know the amount of compensation we're going to pay out is going to be about 1.3 million. And we know what the likelihood is. It's 1 in 100,000 years times the 25 years we're going to run the plant for. So if we run that down, the calculation down permanent injuries, serious and slight injuries, we get a total benefit of 9,000, just over £9,000. So what does that mean? Well, a total benefit of £9,000 using a disproportion factor of 10 gives you an appropriate spend of £93,000. So this would mean that if one of the prevention measures we're looking at is 150,000, we could not spend that money, and we could ensure not that the risk and the explosion doesn't happen, because the chances are it may happen, slim chances we've seen, but it may happen. The 93,000 figure is to enable organisations to prove, should it go wrong, that they've taken reasonable steps, and that the steps they were looking to take here and the costs they were looking to incur were grossly disproportionate. And that will mean not that they don't have to pay compensation out, but they'll be insured for that type of thing anyway. But it means that, one, the insurance will be payable and the insurance company won't come after them for gross negligence. And secondly, it means that the health and safety won't prosecute them for potential corporate manslaughter, which, as I'm sure you all agree, is something very few corporates want, and certainly very few executives and very few corporates want. So another example, we're going to pick the NHS. So the NHS works on a fixed budget, and I'm pretty sure everyone who listens to this will probably be working in organisations with fixed budgets. So NICE, the clinical excellence people who basically look at the cost effectiveness of things, measure cost effectiveness in what they call quality adjusted life year, or QALY. So a QALY of 1 is extending a 1 life by 1 fit year. 0 is dead, and 2 is sort of bedridden. So a QALY of 1 could be 1 fit year for one person, or it could be 2 bedridden years for one person, or anything in between, or it could be sort of four permanently disabled years and that sort of thing. They also use ISA, which is incremental cost effectiveness ratio, because we're very unlucky to live in the first world. It's quite rare for a new treatment to come along where there isn't already a treatment in place. So they use this sort of cost of 1 minus cost of 2 divided by effectiveness of 1, effectiveness of 2. So let's have a look at how this works. So let's give an example. So let's say a new drug costs £50,000 for a year's for a treatment cycle, and the current generic treatment or drugs cost £20,000. Clinical studies on the new drug has shown that it extends life by 5 years at 0.6 QALYs. So it's not 5 years at fully fit health, but then again, these are probably if this is an end of life enhancing cancer drug, then you're unlikely to get fit lives anyway. The current drug has 3 years at 0.5, so that equals sort of 1.5 QALYs. So the ISA calculation, in effect, is we're looking at a £30,000 increase in cost to give us an increment of 1.5 QALYs, which is the difference between the 1.5 QALYs you get on the current drug compared to the delta for the 3 QALYs on the new drug. So basically that's 20,000. That comes out a rough calculation of £20,000 per QALY. Well, the good news is the NHS's current cost calculations are running at about 30,000. And let me give you some examples which aren't quite so pleasant. So a breast cancer drug which extends the life for non-curable breast cancer, Cadicila, is £180,000 per QALY, and NICE decided not to fund it. And I'm sure we'll remember the heart-wrenching story of Aisha King's family, who, after the NHS decided that the funding of radiotherapy in Prague wasn't cost effective, they fled to Spain to sell their house to raise the funds for the non-NHS treatment. So this is where it all sort of sometimes falls over. So although the NHS has a fixed budget and we make all these cost calculations, it's then incredibly difficult for politicians and for NHS managers to then, in the face of Daily Mail headlines and dying children, to then justify this overall spend. So everyone's happy with the idea of this overall cap, but when it affects individual people, then obviously it becomes much more personal and it's far difficult. Hence, we end up with £200 million cancer drug funds because NICE has suggested that these aren't cost effective. However, if you're the person whose life is ending through cancer, I'm pretty sure £180,000 isn't at the top of your mind. So in the real world, cost calculations always count. Risk is used to justify the appropriate levels of spend. More importantly, risk is used to justify not spending money. And mature risk models, as we've seen in the last two, actually determine spend. So how does that relate to PCI? So like other industries, the prescription of a risk assessment process has always been required for PCI compliance. It's been in the standard since version 1 came out in 2003, 2004. And over the last 10 years, it's always been enhanced. And actually, in the latest version 3, there's quite a large enhancement into the risk assessment process. However, PCI DSS is a very prescriptive binary control set with yes and no's. And risk is 50 shades of grey, which is why we think risk is far sexier than compliance. And what does full compliance mean? Blanket adherence to the entire control set for the entirety of my business? Well, that's unlikely to work, and it's unlikely to be cost effective. So, is there no place for risk in a binary standard? Well, that depends on whether people are requiring you to tick every box. And as you would have heard from John Elliott from Visa in the main plenary session, nobody wants you to tick every box. There's plenty of options for you to decide that these aren't the boxes you need to tick. to get full compliance. So when PCI first came out, version 1 in 2003-4, there was no risk-based approach. It was in 12 sections, and people basically got the standard, read 1.1.1, and started going, right, that's where I'll start. The problem was that some of the higher risk elements were sitting further down the standard. So 4 to 5 years later, version 1.2 came out, and with that there was a prioritization of the elements within the standard, and it moved from a 12-section standard to a 6 prioritized approach milestone standard. But let's just take a step back here. Who prioritized it? And why was it prioritized? And what were the thoughts, what were the risks they were trying to alleviate when they were looking at prioritization? Well, if you look at the market, who writes the rules? We have the issuers, which are financial institutions. We have the card schemes, which are financial institutions, and we have the acquirers, which are financial institutions. So they come about this from a sort of financial institution risk management point of view. Well, we're retailers, well, most of you are, and you're not FIs. So it's likely that the prioritization which was put in place to address the risks of the issuers and the acquirers and the card schemes, rather than the retailers. So does a risk-based approach help PCI as a retailer? Well, it depends on whose risk it addresses. If it addresses your risk, then absolutely. If it's addressing other people's risks, then potentially not. And how does PPI DSS help the bank? Well, in effect, it's been a license for them to print money, and it's been a very good way of them enforcing unfair for contracts. So my risks, but not your risks. So how do we do that? So what is a risk assessment? A risk assessment is an accurate, repeatable, standardized methodology of understanding the impact and likelihood of events happening. It needs to focus on pre-control. If you focus on pre-control, then you're able to go and change the impact levels when things like SONY occur. So previously we were saying to corporates, it's highly unlikely people are going to be destructive within your network because the main motivation is theft. And if I break you, then I can't come back and steal more from you. So it's far more likely that they're not going to break you. They're just going to stay in there on command and control, constantly siphoning new information from you as it comes into the business. However, as we've seen with Sony Entertainment, the landscape's changed. So if you're measuring pre-control risk, you can go back to your risk assessment and you can increase the likelihood of a breach of integrity, i.e. somebody coming in and smashing your networks up with electronic hammers. My understanding is Sony Entertainment networks still aren't fully functional. And this is, I think, now 4 or 5 months afterwards. And actually, if they weren't owned by Sony Corporation, you wonder if it was a small independent studio, whether they would have ever recovered. So information risk assessments look at breaches in confidentiality, integrity, and availability of the information asset. And this enables you to have an understanding of the levels of risk and threat you're facing, and therefore the appropriate binary controls to implement, audit, and operationally run to ensure you have an ALARP type process. And then it addresses your risks, not other people's risks. And then it deals with C, I, and A rather than just C. If you don't believe me, if you think the PCI standard is written around you, here is how the balance of questions go against confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So from where the FIs and the card schemes stand, if your website, your trading website goes down for a couple of weeks, well, at least you can't lose their card data. So potentially going through risk assessments may highlight if availability is key for you, which if it's a trading website or a till network is probably incredibly likely. There may be other controls from other standards you want to bring in to ensure a far more balanced approach in addressing your own risk. So what makes a good risk assessment? Well, buy-in and consensus is key here, and it needs to be brought in at a senior level, because it is only at the senior level they're going to sign off the money to address the risks in the business. It needs to have structure to it. It needs to identify risks regardless of controls, although it needs to be mindful of them. It needs to be evidence-based. It's got to form the basis for all InfoSec spend decisions. And knowledge of threats, resources, intents, and drivers are essential here, but it must be easily repeatable because threats, resources, intents, and drivers are constantly changing. So some of the problems you're going to come across, or some of the questions you're going to come across, and some of the quandaries the businesses are going to ask themselves are things like, well, what is acceptable risk? Is acceptable to whom? So if you ask a bank, losing one card is an appalling thing to do. But as a business, you may be happy with losing 1,000. If you lose under 100, it's highly unlikely anyone's going to attribute that theft back to you anyway. Am I worried about risk of non-compliance? Am I risk about loss of card data? Do I care about the loss of availability of my trading website? What about the loss of integrity of the information I hold, or the processes or applications I have? How do I go about calculating the impact? Impact based on what? How much will it cost me? Can I reduce the impact? How do I reduce the impact? Can I use non-technical ways to reduce the impact? Could I use cyber insurance to protect it? Am I already insured under things like PI and other types of coverage? What am I actually liable for? So do I want to spend money on reducing the risk of PED tampering in my 500 or 1,000 stores when currently I'm not actually liable for fraud out of PED tampering? Am I worried about fraudulent transactions, or as I like to call them, online shoplifting? For those of us who've had shops, we've been pretty good at dealing with shoplifting, although my understanding is we've just gone through a record year. Those of us with websites without the high street experience are finding out that shoplifting doesn't just necessarily need to be a physical thing. Likelihood. How on earth do I assess likelihood? Likelihood of what? Is it possibility? Am I wanting to do probability? How many 1 in 100-year storms do you need to change the metrics? So we're constantly hearing this is the hottest, coldest, warmest since records began. Well, if records began a year ago, then it would be. 100-year storm, we're constantly hearing that we're being battered by 100-year storms. Well, if you get 10 storms in 100 years, is it a 1 in 100-year storm? Surely it's a 1 in 10-year storm. So some questions on likelihood. So here's some interesting questions. How many UK EMV retailers have been hacked since Europe implemented EMV? Well, the answer to that is 1. How many websites have been hacked? Well, the answer to that is probably most. What e-com site is least likely, least risky? And how do I best protect this? Do I weigh up abandonment issues of using things like hosted payment pages over the risk of data loss from on-site hosted pages? Is a call center more likely to lose data than a till network? How many employees have stolen data in the last 5 or 10 years? Am I more likely that it's going to be an accidental internal loss than a malicious external loss? How do we use PCI and risk assessments to reduce the cost? So look, since the early days, you've been allowed to put more than just yes, no in place. You've been allowed the use of compensating controls, and you've been allowed the use of not applicable. Now, in the latest couple of versions, we've also got not tested. And in version 3, they've massively strengthened the risk assessment requirements.